The people who win the biggest fights in life almost never look like they are fighting. Watch them closely, and you will notice something strange. While everyone around them is trading insults, defending their name, explaining themselves at 3 in the morning, they say almost nothing, and somehow, months later, they are the ones still standing, while their loudest critics have already moved on to attack somebody else. There is a reason for that, and it is not luck. The moment you stand face to face with someone who is trying to manipulate you and you argue back, you have already lost. Not because your argument is weak, because you just proved to them that their strategy works. You reacted. You gave them the one thing they were fishing for. Machiavelli understood something most people never learn. Real victory is not making your opponent admit they were wrong. Real victory is making them realize they never had power over you in the first place, and watching them figure that out alone, in silence, with no audience left to perform for. If that sentence landed somewhere in your chest, write this in the comments before you keep watching. My silence is my strength, not for the algorithm, for yourself, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly what that discipline is protecting you from, and why almost nobody around you has learned it yet. Here is the part nobody tells you about manipulation. It does not target your intelligence. It targets your nervous system. A manipulator is not trying to win an argument with you. They are trying to trigger a reaction they can then use against you. Your anger is not a side effect of their behavior. It is the entire objective. Everything else, the comment, the accusation, the passive remark dropped in front of other people, is just the delivery mechanism. Picture a chess grandmaster who loses a piece early in a match. An amateur slams the table, sighs loudly, mutters under their breath, glances at the clock like it personally betrayed them, and every one of those reactions tells the opponent something. It tells them where the fear is. It tells them which pressure point produces panic and which one produces recklessness. A grandmaster does none of that. The face stays flat. The hand moves the next piece at the same pace as the last one, not because losing the piece did not matter, but because the grandmaster understands that broadcasting the internal reaction hands the opponent a map of the entire board that is happening inside your skull. Every flinch is intelligence. Every outburst is a data point handed over for free, and a skilled opponent will spend the rest of the match exploiting exactly what you just showed them. This is precisely what happens when someone provokes you, and you respond in kind. You think you are defending yourself. You are actually confirming a hypothesis. The manipulator floated a comment, a jab, an accusation, specifically to see what would come back. When you explode, when you defend, when you send the 4-paragraph text message at midnight, explaining every reason you are not the person they are describing, you just told them the exact combination that opens your vault, and once they have that combination, they will use it again. Not because they are especially clever, because you handed them the instructions, gift-wrapped, with a note attached explaining exactly where it hurts. Think about fire for a moment. A single spark landing on wet stone does nothing. It has nowhere to go. It dies on contact, and within a second there is no evidence it ever existed. That same spark landing in a bed of dry kindling becomes a blaze in seconds. The spark did not create the fire. The kindling did. Provocation works exactly the same way. An insult, a slight, a manufactured crisis, these are all sparks. They are designed to land on something flammable inside you, your ego, your fear of being misunderstood, your need to be seen as right in front of an audience that is, more often than not, barely paying attention. If that material is not there, if you have starved it deliberately, the spark simply has nothing to ignite. The manipulator strikes the match and watches it go out in their own hand. And there is nothing quite as disarming to a manipulator as watching their best move produce absolutely nothing. This is the part where most self-improvement content stops. And it is also the part where it becomes useless, because it tells you to simply stay calm without explaining what calm is actually doing strategically. Staying calm is not about being a peaceful person. It is not about spiritual detachment or pretending you feel nothing. It is about denying an opponent the raw material their entire strategy depends on. The manipulator's plan was never a plan against your character. It was a bet on your predictability. They ran the numbers on you before they ever opened their mouth, and silence is how you make sure that bet does not pay out. There is an old idea, one you have probably heard second-hand without knowing where it came from, that a wound reveals more about a fighter than a punch does. Watch how someone absorbs an insult, and you learn everything you need to know about how to defeat them permanently. This is why the people who seem hardest to manipulate are not cold or emotionless. They have simply learned to process the reaction internally, at their own pace, on their own schedule, instead of letting someone else set the timer on when they are allowed to feel something. Consider the version of this that plays out in an ordinary week. A colleague makes a comment in a meeting designed to make you look unprepared in front of people whose opinion matters to your career. Every instinct says, defend yourself immediately, right there, in front of the same room. But immediate defense, delivered with any heat at all, reads to the room as confirmation that the comment landed somewhere true, even when it was not true at all. The person who says almost nothing in the moment, who answers with 2 calm sentences and moves the meeting forward, denies the room the show it was quietly hoping for. 3 weeks later, when that same colleague tries the same move again, it does not land the same way twice, because everyone in the room has already learned that provoking you produces nothing worth watching, and a strategy that produces nothing eventually gets abandoned. The same pattern shows up online, just faster, and with a larger audience watching. A stranger leaves a comment engineered to get under your skin, worded just carefully enough to sound like an observation instead of an attack. Reply within the hour, and you have handed that stranger something they did not actually earn, your attention, on their terms, in front of everyone who follows you. Let it sit, unanswered, for a full day, and something interesting happens. Most provocations online are not built to survive a day. They were built to survive the 10 minutes right after posting, when the reaction is freshest and the algorithm is most generous to conflict. Silence does not defeat the comment. It simply outlasts the window in which the comment was ever going to matter. So the next time you feel that familiar heat rising in your chest, the urge to respond immediately, to correct the record, to make absolutely sure they know they are wrong, pause and ask yourself one question. Is this fire mine, or did someone just hand me a match? Because once you can answer that honestly, every single time, you stop being a nervous system. Someone else can play like an instrument, and you start being the one person in the room whose reactions cannot be predicted or purchased. There is a version of this worth naming because it catches people who think they have already mastered it. Staying silent in the moment of provocation is the easy half of the discipline. The harder half is staying silent afterward, in the hours that follow, when the replay starts running in your head, uninvited. You did not say anything out loud, but you are now rehearsing the perfect comeback in the shower, drafting the message you are not going to send, narrating the argument you already won in your imagination. This is not silence. This is delayed combustion. The provocation still got its fuel. It just collected it later, in private, where it does no damage to the manipulator and considerable damage to your own peace of mind. Real composure is not winning the argument internally after the fact. It is letting the moment pass without needing to win it at all, anywhere, even in a version of the conversation that only you will ever hear. But controlling your reaction is only the entry price. It gets you into the game. It does not win it. Because there is something far more dangerous than reacting too fast. And it is something almost nobody talks about. And it explains why the people who seem to be losing every public argument are often the ones actually winning the war that matters. Every manipulator, every liar, every person running a con on you socially or professionally is operating on a hidden clock. And they built that clock assuming you would confront them fast. They are counting on you to expose them immediately, because immediate exposure is exactly what they have prepared for. They have their story ready. They have their excuses lined up in order of persuasiveness. They have rehearsed the wounded expression, the counter-accusation, the pivot to how unfair you are being, for even bringing it up in the first place. What they have not prepared for is silence that stretches past the moment they expected it to end, because that silence was never in their script. Here is what behavioral research on deception consistently finds, and it is more useful than almost anything else in this entire conversation. Lying is not a single event. It is a maintenance project. Every fabrication a person tells creates a debt that has to be serviced with more fabrication later, because reality keeps producing new situations that the original lie was never built to survive. Researchers studying dishonesty describe this as a compounding effect. One small lie requires a second lie to protect it, and that second lie requires a third, and the structure gets more elaborate and more fragile with every added layer, until the person maintaining it is essentially running two separate versions of events in their head at all times, praying the two versions never get compared side by someone patient enough to notice the seams. There is a similar finding in the research on how people fool themselves after cheating or exaggerating once. The self-deception fades only when a person is repeatedly confronted with plain, unambiguous evidence of the gap between what they claimed and what actually happened. One clean confrontation rarely does it. It takes repeated contact with reality, over time, before the story collapses on its own, which is exactly why one dramatic confrontation from you, delivered once, in the heat of the moment, was never going to be the thing that ended it. What ends it is reality itself, showing up again and again in small ways, until the story can no longer hold its own weight. The person who confronts a liar immediately does that liar an enormous favor. Immediate confrontation forces the liar to produce only one explanation on the spot, in a controlled setting where they had time to prepare a plausible answer in advance, sometimes days in advance. But a liar left alone, unconfronted, still operating under the belief that they got away with it clean, keeps talking, keeps adding details to make the story feel more textured and believable, keeps building the structure higher without anyone checking whether the foundation can actually hold the added weight. and a structure built on nothing eventually has to touch the ground somewhere. Give it enough time and enough rope, and it always contradicts itself, not because you caught it in some clever trap, but because it was never engineered to be permanent in the first place. Nothing built on fabrication was ever designed for the long term. It was only ever designed to survive tonight. This is the strategic value of watching instead of confronting. Machiavelli's entire worldview rested on a blunt observation about human nature that still holds up centuries later. People reveal what they actually are through their patterns, not through their promises. Anyone can manage a single performance for one evening, one interview, one apology. Almost nobody can manage that same performance across months, across contexts, across the small, unguarded moments when they believe no one of consequence is paying attention. The mask is expensive to wear continuously. Time is the tax collector that eventually gets its due, with interest from everyone who thought they could avoid paying. Here is where I want you to notice something about your own instincts, because this is where most people sabotage themselves without ever realizing it happened. The urge to confront early does not come from strength, it comes from discomfort. Sitting with an unresolved suspicion is genuinely uncomfortable, so the mind wants to resolve it immediately. Even when resolving it early means surrendering every ounce of leverage that patience would eventually have produced. Confrontation feels like power, because it feels active, decisive, righteous in the moment. Observation feels like weakness, because it looks passive from the outside, like you are simply letting something happen to you. But the person collecting evidence, while appearing to do nothing, is playing a completely different game than the person who needs the discomfort to end today, right now, on their own schedule. One of them is optimizing for how they feel in the next 10 minutes. The other is optimizing for the truth that will exist in 10 weeks, when it can no longer be talked away. So the discipline is this: when you sense a lie, do not announce that you sense it. Widen the field instead. Give the story room to keep growing, because a growing story has more surface area for contradiction than a short one ever will. Ask a question you already know the answer to, and note precisely how the response compares to what you actually know to be true. Say almost nothing and watch what the silence pulls out of the other person, because uncomfortable silence has a way of making people talk simply to fill it, and what fills a silence under pressure is rarely rehearsed. A liar is prepared for your accusation, word for word. A liar is almost never prepared for your patience, because patience does not feel like an attack, so nobody thinks to build a defense against it. And once the contradiction surfaces on its own, in its own time, with no fingerprints from you anywhere near it, you are no longer the person making an accusation that can be denied, deflected, or turned back around on you. You are simply the person who happened to notice what was already falling apart under its own weight. That is a position almost no one can argue you out of, because you never took a position in the first place. You just waited for the truth to arrive on its own legs. There is a version of this that shows up in friendships and partnerships, and it is often more painful than the version that shows up with strangers, because you want so badly to believe the story the first time you hear it. Someone close to you offers an explanation for a broken promise, a missed payment, a pattern of disappearing when you need them. The explanation sounds reasonable in isolation. It always does, because it was built to sound reasonable in isolation. The mistake is treating each explanation as its own separate case, judged fresh, with no memory of the last one. Machiavelli's insight applies here with brutal precision. A pattern is not a series of unrelated incidents. It is a single incident, repeating, and every repetition is additional evidence that the person telling you the story is not describing reality. They are managing your reaction to it. Once you stop grading each excuse individually and start laying them side by side, the story that looked reasonable one conversation at a time starts to look like exactly what it is when viewed as a whole, which brings us to something almost nobody protects. And it is the reason so many people who are genuinely careful with their words and their reactions still get outmaneuvered anyway. They guard their emotions with real discipline. They guard their patience with real discipline. And then they hand their entire plan, fully formed, to a room full of people who had no business knowing it existed yet. There is a principle from military architecture that Machiavelli studied closely, because he understood that political survival and physical survival follow the exact same underlying rules. When a fortress is designed properly, its walls are built with deliberate twists and recesses, so an approaching enemy can never see the full layout at once and can never find one clean angle of attack from a distance. The worst mistake a defender can make is building something outside the main wall, some exposed outpost meant to project strength and impress onlookers, because that outpost becomes the very first thing an enemy targets. And once it falls, and it almost always falls first, because it was never protected by the real defenses, the psychological damage spreads inward, even if the main wall is never actually touched. Genoa learned this the hard way when it built bastions outside its own city walls as a show of confidence. Those bastions fell almost immediately, once the city came under real attack, and their fall cracked the morale of the entire population before the real walls were ever seriously threatened. The lesson was never about stone. It was about exposure. Do not build anything you cannot fully defend in plain view of people who are already waiting for a reason to attack it. Translate that into your own life, and the pattern becomes uncomfortably obvious. Every time you announce a goal, before you have any real progress toward it, you are building a bastion outside your own walls. You feel a rush of validation when people react with excitement and encouragement. And that rush feels exactly like momentum, but it is a borrowed feeling, because the actual work has not happened yet, and the feeling has nothing underneath it. Worse, you have now given every person around you a target, the ones who feel quietly threatened by your ambition, and there are always some, even among people who love you, now know exactly where to aim their doubt, their subtle discouragement, their small comments about being realistic, their private hope that you fail, so their own inaction finally feels justified in comparison. You did their targeting for them, free of charge, before you had even finished the first draft of the plan. Compare that to a seed. Nothing about a seed underground looks like progress to anyone watching from above. There is no ceremony, no announcement, no one clapping or asking how it is going. For weeks it appears to be doing nothing at all, and to an outside observer, nothing is exactly what seems to be happening down there. But underground, in complete darkness, in total silence, the root system is doing the only work that actually determines the outcome, the work that decides whether anything visible will ever survive its first real contact with wind. By the time the seed breaks the surface, it is no longer fragile. It has already secured everything it needed, while no one was watching closely enough to interfere with the process. This is not a suggestion to become secretive out of paranoia, or to hide your life from the people who genuinely care about you. It is a recognition that announcement and achievement are two completely different currencies, and most people spend the first one because it is cheaper and it pays out immediately, while the second one is expensive and pays out late, sometimes very late. Every time you explain your plan before it is real, you are trading a future win for a small hit of present tense approval, and that trade almost never favors you in the long run. The people who move quietly are not hiding because they are ashamed of what they are building. They are protecting the only version of the plan that has not yet been exposed to interference, doubt, or theft. So here is the discipline. Let your results introduce your intentions on your behalf. Let people find out what you were building at the exact moment it is already standing, already functioning, already too far along to sabotage, even if someone wanted to. Not because you owe anyone secrecy as a matter of principle, but because you understand that a goal spoken too early is a goal that now has to survive an audience it never actually needed in order to succeed. There is a difference worth drawing here between privacy and secrecy, because the two get confused constantly, and the confusion causes real damage to real relationships. Secrecy is hiding something because you are ashamed of it, or because you intend to deceive someone who has a right to know. Privacy is simply declining to hand unfinished work to people who cannot help it grow and can only expose it to unnecessary risk. Telling your partner about a career change you are considering is not the bastion Machiavelli warned against, announcing it to 400 people on social media before you have taken a single concrete step toward it, purely for the validation of the announcement itself, is. The fortress principle was never about isolation. It was about choosing exactly who stands inside the walls with you, and being honest about the difference between someone who can strengthen the plan and someone who can only spectate it. If you have made it this far, I want you to notice something about yourself, because it says more than you might think it does. Most people do not have the patience to sit through an argument that asks them to slow down instead of speeding up, to watch instead of react, to build instead of announce. The fact that you are still here means you belong to the smaller group of people capable of doing the quiet work this entire philosophy actually depends on, and that quality is rarer among viewers and among people in general than anyone likes to admit out loud. Now, before we go further, there is a specific trap waiting for exactly the kind of person who has absorbed everything up to this point, because understanding manipulation does not make you immune to a different, quieter drain on your energy, and it shows up the moment you start achieving anything worth noticing. Not every attack deserves a response, and learning to tell the difference is one of the most underrated skills a person can spend a lifetime building. When you start moving quietly and producing real, visible results, criticism does not disappear. It often increases, because visible progress makes people uncomfortable in ways they rarely admit even to themselves, let alone out loud to you. The instinct is to answer every criticism, correct every misreading, clarify every misunderstanding, because leaving something unanswered feels like leaving a wound open in front of everyone. But most public criticism is not actually a request for clarification. It is a bid for your attention, dressed up as concern, or principle, or simple honesty, And the moment you respond to it, you have confirmed to everyone watching that the bid worked exactly as intended. Picture throwing a stone into a puddle of muddy water. The water was already unclear before the stone ever landed. Now watch what happens when you throw a second stone in, trying to somehow clean the water up, trying to argue your way back to clarity through sheer force of explanation. The water does not get clearer. It gets more disturbed. Every stone you throw stirs up more sediment from the bottom. And now the entire argument is not about the original point at all. It is about the fight itself, about tone, about who said what first. And onlookers, who had no opinion 5 minutes ago, now have a front row seat to watching you look defensive in real time, which is the single least persuasive position a person can occupy in public. You did not win anything. You just made the mud thicker and personally invited more people to come watch you stand in it. This is exactly the trap that swallows people who are otherwise disciplined in every other part of this philosophy. They handled the manipulator's provocation with silence. They watched the liar's story fall apart with patience. They kept their plans quiet while the real work got done underground. And then a critic online, or a colleague in a hallway, or a stranger in a comment section, throws a single line that seems to demand correction, and all that hard-won discipline evaporates in one reply, typed in under 30 seconds, because criticism has a specific gravitational pull that direct manipulation does not carry in the same way. It appeals to fairness. It whispers that if you do not respond, everyone watching will assume the criticism must be true, and that whisper is exactly what keeps otherwise strategic, otherwise composed people trapped in comment sections at midnight, defending a version of themselves that nobody who actually matters to their life was ever going to doubt in the first place. The selection process matters more than the response itself ever could. Ask whether the criticism comes from someone whose opinion actually shapes your real outcomes, your income, your relationships, your future, or whether it comes from someone whose only involvement in your life is watching from a safe distance and quietly hoping for a reaction to screenshot. Ask whether responding would change anything real about your situation, or whether it would simply change how loud the argument gets for an audience that will forget the whole exchange by tomorrow afternoon. Most criticism fails both of these tests without exception. It comes from people with no actual stake in your results, and responding to it changes nothing except how much energy you have left over for the work that genuinely matters. Look at how this plays out with two people who receive the identical piece of criticism on the same afternoon. One spends the next 2 hours drafting a response, deleting it, rewriting it, checking to see if anyone has replied yet. The other reads it once, closes the app, and goes back to the thing they were building before the notification arrived. 6 months later, only one of them has anything to show for those 2 hours, and it was never going to be the one who spent them typing. The people who seem unbothered by criticism are rarely unbothered on the inside. They have simply done the math in advance. They know that every public response is a withdrawal from a finite account, an account that should be spent almost exclusively on building, not on managing the passing opinions of people who were never going to be satisfied, regardless of what you said or how carefully you said it. So they let the mud settle on its own, because mud, given enough time and enough stillness, always does exactly that. There is one thing worth saying plainly here, and it deserves its own moment before we move on. If you find yourself constantly needing people to understand you correctly, constantly needing the record set straight in every conversation. That need is not really about the critic standing in front of you at all. It is about a deeper hunger for approval that manipulators and casual critics alike can sense from a distance, because it is the one lever that never stops working on the people who carry it. The goal is not to stop caring what anyone thinks of you. That would not even be healthy. The goal is to stop needing every single person to think the correct thing about you before you can feel steady on your own feet. That distinction, small as it sounds, is the entire difference between someone who can be provoked on command and someone who genuinely cannot. Which brings us to the final piece of this, the one that ties everything else together, because everything we have covered so far, the silence, the patience, the discreet movement, the selective battles, all of it eventually has to answer one single question. If you are not defending yourself, not confronting the liar directly, not announcing your plans early, not correcting every critic who takes a shot at you, then what exactly proves you right in the end? The answer is the only answer that has ever consistently mattered. And Machiavelli said it specifically about rulers. But it applies with equal force to anyone building anything of real consequence. People judge by results, not by intentions, not by explanations, not by how eloquently you can articulate what you were trying to accomplish along the way. In his writing on rulers, Machiavelli observed that the vast majority of people only ever see what a person appears to be from the outside, and only a small few ever get close enough to know what someone actually is underneath that appearance. And even that small few, he noted with a kind of cold clarity, rarely dare to contradict the judgment of the crowd, because the crowd carries the weight of general opinion behind it. And general opinion follows outcomes far more reliably than it follows arguments, no matter how well constructed those arguments happen to be. This means every single hour spent explaining yourself to someone who has already made up their mind is an hour subtracted from the one thing that will actually change their mind eventually, which is a result they simply cannot argue with, no matter how hard they try. You can spend a year defending your character in comment sections and group chats, or you can spend that exact same year producing something undeniable, and only one of those two investments compounds over time. Explanation has no interest rate attached to it. It gets you back exactly what you put in, if you are lucky, and usually less. Because arguments about character rarely conclude cleanly, they just exhaust both sides until everyone quietly agrees to disagree and moves on unconvinced and slightly more annoyed than before. Results do not require anyone's agreement. They simply exist, sitting there in plain view. And existence is a far harder thing to argue with than any explanation you could ever offer in its place. There is a colder edge to this worth naming directly. Explaining yourself repeatedly does not just fail to convince people. It quietly signals that you need their verdict in order to feel secure in your own version of events. And the people most inclined to exploit that need are, unsurprisingly, the same manipulators who opened this entire conversation. They are not impressed by your explanation. They are cataloging it, filing it away as proof that pressure eventually produces a response from you. The only move that removes you from that catalog entirely is the one that requires no explanation at all, because it has already spoken for itself before anyone thought to ask a question. Look at how this plays out with two people who both want to change careers in the same year. One of them tells every friend, every relative, every acquaintance at every dinner party about the business they are launching, the book they are writing, the industry they are about to break into. For a few weeks the attention feels wonderful. Then the specific questions start arriving. How is it going? Did you finish it yet? Have you launched? Each question is small, harmless on its own. But the cumulative weight of answering them, of managing everyone else's timeline for your progress, becomes its own second job. One that produces nothing except mild dread every time the phone buzzes. The other person says nothing. They tell no one. They work on it in the early mornings and late evenings. And when people ask what they have been up to, they give a vague, pleasant answer and change the subject. A year later, one of them is still explaining a delay to an audience that has quietly started to doubt them. The other one sends a single message with a finished result attached, and the questions that used to demand daily updates disappear instantly, replaced by something closer to respect. Nothing about the second person's work ethic was different. What was different is that they never let the announcement become a debt. The result then had to repay. Think about the chess grandmaster again, the one who lost a piece early and said nothing about it, whose face never once betrayed what that loss actually cost. At the end of the match, nobody in the room remembers the silence. Nobody remembers the flat expression or the perfectly steady hand. They remember the board, and who was still standing over it when the very last piece finally moved into position. The silence was never the point of the whole performance. It was simply the discipline that protected the only thing that was ever going to matter in the end, which was the outcome sitting on the table once the noise had completely died down. This is the uncomfortable truth buried underneath everything we have covered today. Spending your energy trying to prove people wrong is a losing trade, even in the moments when your argument is completely, unambiguously correct, because you are still paying out a currency that only ever produces temporary relief and no lasting return. Spending that same energy on becoming undeniable instead is the only investment in this entire equation that pays out permanently. Because once the result exists in the world, no one can retroactively argue it back out of existence, no matter how loudly or how cleverly they try. The people who understood this were never coldly indifferent to what others thought of them. They simply understood the correct order of operations. Build first. Let the crowd catch up to what has already happened, on its own time, at its own pace. So here is where I actually land on all of this, and it will not sit comfortably with everyone watching, and it is not supposed to. The people who talk the most about being misunderstood are usually the people who have produced the least evidence to be understood correctly in the first place. Silence is not a personality trait, and it was never meant to be one. It is a resource, and like every resource that matters, it should be spent only where it produces a genuine return. Spend it on staying calm when someone is fishing for your reaction. Spend it on watching instead of confronting when someone is lying to your face. Spend it on building quietly instead of announcing loudly before there is anything real to announce. And save your voice, your actual voice, for the one moment it has ever reliably worked in your favor, which is standing next to a result so complete that no further explanation is ever required from you again. Here is the question I want you to sit with after this ends. Where in your life right now are you still explaining yourself to someone who was only ever going to be convinced by results? and never by your words. Tell me exactly where in the comments. And if this changed how you think about the next argument you almost had, subscribe, because there is a great deal more of this game left to learn, and almost nobody around you was ever taught the actual rules.